Hi, welcome back to this channel. I'm the Spell Singer, and this is my ongoing review of the Fighting Fantasy Gamebook series. This review is going to bring you a quick look at this title and book number, followed by a read through of the blurb, go through the plot for this book, talk about the game mechanics and look at that adventure sheet, and then go through the artwork, which I'll run through this video, talk about my likes and dislikes, any fun facts and errors that are worth mentioning, and we'll look at the score. We'll give it a score and a summary at the end out of 10, and I'll finish on any shout-outs that I might have. So this is Temple of Terror. This is book 14, and it was written by Ian Livingstone, so another solo effort by Sir Ian. The publication date was 1985, so we're still in that era of game books, and the cover art here was by a gentleman by the name of Christos Achilleos, and is an absolute corker. I mean, it really does grab your attention. The internal artwork for this one was by a fellow by Bill Houston, and he does a really good job as well at portraying the kind of world that you're in Temple of Terror. Let's have a look at the blurb for this book. This one reads, "The dark, twisted power of the young Malbordus is reaching its zenith. All he needs to do now is retrieve the 5 dragon artefacts which have been hidden for centuries in the lost city of Vatos, somewhere in the desert of skulls. Each day that passes brings him closer to them, and you can only stop him. Your mission is to reach the lost city before Malbordus and destroy the treasure he seeks. But beware, each step takes and leads you closer to your doom." So there you go, there's the blurb. The plot for this one is quite straightforward. So basically in this book, you're hired by the good wizard of Yastromo, so remember him from the previous books, and you're pitted against this evil Malbordus, who's obviously the villain, and he's poised to gain the power of the dark elves and basically lead an army to conquer Alancia. So it's that whole save the world business again. And all that he requires are the 5 dragon artefacts, which are the essential items in this book. And they're hidden throughout the lost city of Vatos, which is somewhere in the desert of skulls. And you must locate this basically before the final confrontation with Malbordus to stand any chance. The Temple of Terror, the desert setting lends the story a kind of unique feel to it, kind of Middle Eastern feel almost, both in terms of the setting and the opponents that you face there. And as with many of these Livingstone adventures, like City of Thieves and Crypt of the Sorcerer, which we'll come on to in the future, you have to basically collect a series of these artefacts in order to be successful in that final confrontation. And there is the usual twist with a character known as the Messenger of Death, who has he's basically placed these letters around this dungeon at the end in the city of Vatos. And they're all scattered throughout this dungeon, and they make up the word death. So 5 letters on these little templates, basically. So you'll pick these up along your route, and they will claim your life if they are all found. So of course you're searching for all these artifacts, but at the same time, if you search too hard, you could uncover this death curse that's been put on you. And in some ways, Temple of Terror is a bit of a nostalgia trip, with the adventure beginning in Stonebridge. So we were there in Temple of Terror, and you said Temple of Doom there. And of course there's a short trip to Blacksand, which was City of Thieves, so we've been there before you venture off into the Desert of Skulls. And it was written off the back of Freeway Fighter. You could almost be forgiven actually for thinking that Ian missed the world of Titan and Lancia and he wanted to return there, so he pulled this one out of the bag. And there's no real major sort of changes to this book. It's fairly standard adventure. It's good old dungeon romp at the end. So nothing too groundbreaking in this book, but it's still a good entry. So like I said, there's that usual twists and turns that you do get with Ian Livingstone's books, but with the similarities, it doesn't just end with like the places. You've also got the characters as well, like King Gillibrand, who he gets a mention, and also Yastromo, who is the sort of most famous wizard of all in these books, and they both make an appearance. And all in all, straightforward plot with a a fairly linear path to victory. Game mechanics and adventure sheet. Now this one is a fairly standard in terms of mechanics anyway. Temple of Terror has a kind of simple spell casting system. It has 10 different spells that you can choose from. So basically those are listed as Create Water, Creature Sleep, Detect Trap, Fire, Jump, Language, Light, Magic Arrow, Open Door and Read Symbols. And you basically have to choose 4 of those for the adventure. Now there is a stamina penalty for every time that you use magic, a bit like the sorcery series really. So every time you use your magic, you do take a stamina hit, so you've got to be a bit careful about where and when you choose to use your magic. There's no real best selection of spells. They're all quite handy at various sort of places in the dungeon and throughout the story. So to avoid the final section being too easy, Ian disables the magic system completely. So you get to a certain point and it just stops. You can't cast any more magic. And so, yeah, it makes it quite tough, but also forces you to rely on some of the items that you may or may not have picked up throughout the adventure. The adventure sheet I'll put up actually here. So it's all pretty straightforward when you compare it to all the other adventure sheets. It's like a standard generic one, but with the addition of this little area on spells, where you could obviously just make a note of the ones that you choose and keep a record of them. But the provisions and gold are still there, the equipment and items, and of course your skill, stamina and luck scores, all portrayed in the same manner really. So nothing too different with the adventure sheet. The artwork in this book, this was Bill Houston's one and only attempt, I believe, at illustrating this series. And the art is quite decent actually. It depicts the kind of desert landscape really well, giving a kind of dusty, dry feel to everything in the environment. And the dungeon sections are equally good, showing kind of like that darkness and almost claustrophobic feeling as you're sort of venturing your way through this crypt underneath the city of Vatos. Good quality actually, good quality pictures, and as usual I've got a favourite here. This is the messenger of death that I mentioned. So he's there kind of drooling away, pointing the finger at you, because obviously you're the hero, you're the protagonist, and it really kind of comes out at you, and you can't help but as you're reading these books be aware that he is sort of lurking around this dungeon, leaving these letters for you to spell out your doom effectively. So that's a really good feature and a really nice bit of artwork to go with it. Always remember this one as a kid. It's really good, really good. The likes and dislikes for this one, so these vary. In all honesty, I would have liked to have had a little more time in the desert section. Finding the Lost City seemed fairly trivial, a fairly trivial accomplishment. Maybe a slightly shorter portion of the book in Vatos, and then more exploration in the desert. We've been to some of these places before. We've been to Stonebridge, we've been to Black Sand, but the trip across the sea was really good. That led to the desert of Skulls. But more time in the desert would have been maybe a third. Maybe a third in the introduction. So finding your way to the desert, the sea crossing, and then a proper third of this in the desert, and then the final third would have worked out in the dungeon a bit better. So instead of this stage, I think you could say that the dungeon almost takes up half the book. And we've been to these dungeons before, haven't we, with Death Trap and effectively Warlock of Firetop Mountain's kind of like a dungeon in a mountain. But anyway, that's just my personal thoughts on that. Malbordus, the villain himself, he's easily the most forgettable villain so far. I mean, he does have some backstory. In the end, he just shows up. He doesn't really talk or do much. You just have a bit of a fisticuffs with him and it's all over. The book tries to compensate slightly for this, having a secondary villain in the temple's queen, basically. But she doesn't really amount to all that much either. In the end, I think atmosphere is the key winner in Temple of Terror. It's, I think with the heat of the desert, the horror of the messenger creeping around, and the amazing artwork, it really stands out as a high atmosphere book, this one. There's many items that never get used. Now that's a typical Sir Ian trait. By memory, you've got the sealing wax, the ivory beetle charm, the silver mirror, the ebony face mask, the bone flute, and they're all worthless. There's a book that Ian wrote when Scholastic took over called Port of Peril. And in Port of Peril, I think I counted about 40 odd items throughout the whole adventure, 10 of which you use. The rest are barely mentioned again and aren't really that important. So it reminded me of that playing this book. Lots of kind of shopping lists that you have to find and random items that just don't really crop up again and are kind of pointless. So yeah, that's a bit of a shame. I wasn't a big fan of that as such. But yeah, it's common. And the other thing about that is, the really odd thing is, at the beginning of the story, you get told you have a lantern. It's just an item you have right at the start. But the book says you have this, but whenever it would come in handy, like in a dungeon, the book acts as if you're not carrying any source of light. So it's never mentioned again. And every time I needed it, I always thought, well, I've got that lantern that I could use, but never mentioned. Okay, some fun facts for this book. Dragon Master is believed to have been the working title for Temple of Terror, with the working title mentioned a couple of times in the current list or forthcoming list of books that you sometimes found at the beginning of this series. And depending on your interpretation, this adventure can be deemed a sequel to The Forest of Doom, which in itself is a sequel to Caverns of the Snow Witch. And this book was loosely adapted into an AdventureSoft sort of adventure game series for a bunch of home computers like ZX Spectrum, Commodore 64, the Amstrad, CPC, the BBC Micro, and the Acorn. I think Acorn Electron, I think was another one. So it managed to find its way into the digital world as well. And of course, at this sort of time, this sort of physical medium was slowly being superseded by this new world of digital medium. So that was an interesting thing going on. So maybe they were thinking about that while they were writing these books, trying to creep into this digital world that was coming along. There are some errors in this book. There's only a couple I thought I'd mention. One's a real game, well, it's not a game breaker as such. Basically, after you're shipwrecked at the start of the book, you float to shore and you have to test your luck, so nothing new there. Being lucky sends you to reference 78, where you find some food to regain, so I think it's like 3 stamina. However, you also discover that you've lost a 1d6 worth of provisions and possibly 1 luck point as well. So on the other hand, if you're unlucky in that roll, you do not find any food, but you also don't discover any loss of provisions. This only creates a textual inconsistency, kind of a textual inconsistency. But yeah, not only that, but it also means that the unlucky outcome is vastly superior to the lucky one. So that's kind of odd. But yeah, we can get on with that. The other one was, the other error was a sort of, only other really significant error involves this hammer-wielding stone statue that, I think it animates as a stone golem when you find it. So if you pass it on the wrong side, so you meet it, you can pass it to the left or right, but if you pass it on the wrong side, it comes to life. Now, when you first see it, it's described as being made out of bronze. You would, and so like I say, it would be a trivial mistake, except that the dying warrior that you encounter shortly beforehand warns you to beware the shadow of the stone, not bronze, stone. So I think that's the warning, is about the stone golem. I mean, I don't think there are any other golems in this adventure, but it's a bit useless when the thing it's warning you about is described incorrectly. But yeah, you can work that out. Right, so for this one, a summary and score. Back in familiar territory with this Temple of Terror. It's a standard adventure, and you get to visit Black Sand, quick sea crossing, you get to trek across the desert, followed by a dungeon crawl with a few traders to spend some gold along the way. It's similar ground to that of your typical dungeon treasure hunt. Basically, you get to battle the evil wizard, and it's very similar to sort of the plot of Warlock Firetop Mountain. You just replace Zagor with Malbordus, and Vatos with the actual mountain. So yeah, there's some similarities there, but dungeon setting is the bulk of the adventure, and it kind of suffers in comparison to Death Trap Dungeon, which was done better. So we've seen that before, and like the desert setting, but I really like the desert setting actually. It's probably the key point in this book, but it's only a short stretch, and it suffers, for that, I feel. Could have been extended potentially. The spells are really good little mechanic in this. Mostly they're only really useful in 2 or 3 situations though. So they made quite a big deal of that. Some are used more than others, and if you get the wrong ones, you might find that you don't even need to use them at all, depending on which way you go through the dungeon. Where this adventure excels is in its setting and details. So it's got lots of tricks and traps and monsters, and the amazing artwork which accompanies this throughout the story. The end battle of the book is technically wizard versus wizard, but it really comes down to sort of like a standard combat, really, so nothing too new there. It would have been nice if they'd done something like the villain in the Citadel of Chaos, where you have like a turn-based attack, throw some dice, then another turn-based attack, but Malbordus, he received a good background in this one, but has little to do with the adventure itself. And similar is the priestess, Lisha, who serves as kind of like a sub-boss almost. Towards the end, certainly, anyway. And the most memorable villain in this is, for me, the Messenger of Death. It's like this assassin, like I described, is sent by Malbordus to stalk you as you go through his dungeon. So it's a method of killing. So if you uncover those 5 letters, the death spell, then that's it. It's game over. And it followed. This fellow was one of the most sort of memorable parts of the adventure for me. It was a good alternative to his sort of instant deaths that he tends to use as well, Sir Ian. He loves his instant deaths. It's very much an Ian Livingstone book, an adventure. It was a good alternative with the instant death decisions, but a very linear path to victory, which we also see a lot of with Sir Ian. So sort of one true path and nothing else. We've got the usual shopping list of unnecessary items, like I mentioned, but this plot involving Malbordus, it's like standard fighting fantasy romp, really. The treasure hunt nature of things is already sort of known territory, if you like. The ruined desert city occupied by a religious cult had potential to be interesting, but in the end it doesn't really amount to much. Little more than another dungeon crawl, really. And for most of the adventure, Livingstone gets it about right. Difficulty-wise, the path, like I say, to victory is quite narrow. The writing here is sort of Ian's usual style. It's okay. The original cover is great, really stands out, as do the interior illustrations by Bill Houston. So they're really good. So they kind of compensate each other. The desert setting, like I say, is novel, but other than that, it's pretty much everything this book is doing has been done before previously, and dare I say, better. There's many interesting sort of monsters that show up throughout the story, and they're good to be found certainly throughout the dungeon section. The Messenger of Death I keep banging on about, he's like chief amongst them, I would say. But this religious cult that I mentioned, led by Priestess Lisha, is quite intriguing, but never really gets delved into as much as it could do. But yeah, and the fact that I don't know, it states she's like this art collector, and that's really all the background you get. Yeah, she's big on art. So Malbordus gets a good introduction, but confrontation with him is kind of standard, which is a shame, really. But yeah, Temple of Terror, it's sort of middle of the road, still enjoyable. Don't get me wrong, it's a good dungeon romp. It gets the job done well enough, but maybe it's to do with the fact that he's just come off the back of Freeway Fighter, and maybe he'd used up all his creative juices, I don't know. But this one's okay. It's a good old dungeon romp, but all in all, for that reason, I probably wouldn't give it more than 6 out of 10. 6 out of 10 for this book, I think. Yeah, so Temple of Terror. It's an okay entry. I want to give a shout out to someone on YouTube. There's a fella by the name of Michael Bartlett. He's really good. He reviews. He does these kind of reviews, these kind of retrospective reviews of movies and poetry. But he also runs through these books. And at the time of this recording, he has just done, I believe, The Seas of Blood, which is coming up soon. It's a good channel. It's worth having a look at. If you like these kind of reviews, you'll love what he's doing. So yeah, check him out, Michaal Bartlett. He's worth a look. So yeah, I think that's pretty much all I wanted to say about Temple of Terror. So the next book is by Andrew Chapman. So he's back and he's written Rings of Kether, which is kind of like a sci-fi, kind of like a James Bond in space type book. So we'll review that one next. But in the meantime, look after yourselves and I'll see you in the next review.